Great. Okay, so here we are. Welcome to this workshop on climate racism, which I will be leading through this video. And there will be 4 videos, and the first one will be about climate racism in a historical sense, and it will be the longest. So sit tight, have a drink next to you, maybe some pen and paper to make notes, and let's go. So first, a few words about myself. I'm Chihiro. I've been active in the climate movement for over a decade, and I will be also referring to some resources which you can find on my website, chihiro.nl. Also, maybe of interest in your climate justice journey is my film that I made in Bolivia, also offering some perspective on some of the stuff that we're talking here about today in terms of colonialism and climate crises. So enough about me, let's go. A trigger warning. So some slides tell truth depicting colonial violence. This is not for shock value. It is to back up our story of historical accounts with archived proof. So this is only happening in this video. So it's not to be graphic, but it can be triggering. So I want to warn you, please take care of yourself. If you need to just step out for a moment, pause, please do so. You do not need to explain to anyone, especially now that you're not all sitting in a class, but behind your own screen. Also, for those who are not triggered by it, take a moment to reflect that it is a privilege to find history interesting and not traumatic. Or like, what has your life been like to that it taught you such a distance? So naming that, maybe you are not triggered, but you are nonetheless probably traumatized to be alienated from other life, also creates space to reflect about how you've learned to alienate or distance yourself from extreme violence to cope in this society. So enough trigger warnings, let's go. Climate racism. How can the climate be racist? Well, it's not. It's not the climate that is racist. When we talk about climate and racism, we talk about 2 systemic structures. So climate being the system of the atmosphere, and racism being a system of racial division or imposed racialization, because of course we're all one human race. So in this workshop, let me just say what we're going to do. We're going to look at the 4 pillars of climate racism. Today, climate crisis disasters are happening at the rate of 1 a week, though most draw little international attention, and work is urgently needed to prepare developing countries for the profound impacts. The UN has warned. As climate activists, we allowed ourselves to care about climate and see climate change as the problem. However, today we analyze climate change not as the problem, but as a symptom. So we're actually going to look like this climate change didn't just drop from the sky. If we look at the first picture, CO2 in the sky, it was forged by politics, corporate extraction and emission, land grabbing and dumping toxic. So the wrecking of places and peoples. So disturbing the web of life till it systemically entered into a phase of mayhem. So instead of looking up into the sky, today we'll look at grounded realities and what grounded policies and paradigms got us here. So a note about racism. In this talk, we mostly refer to racism as structural. So it's not about personal beliefs, but systemically upheld by policy, law, and impacting people of color to face, as a result, shorter life expectancy or life achievement possibility because of this system of white supremacy. So there are many forms of discrimination. Today is not about personal prejudice. However, you may become aware of how society has groomed you, socialized you to develop prejudice and beliefs. So climate is systemic. Environmental can be both local or systemic. Environmental racism has been researched for a long time with many case studies. But with climate racism, I look at something beyond a case study, to historical, political, military, media racism intersecting with atmospheric disturbance, also known as climate wrecking, climate impacts, climate disasters, and the response. So let's go. Starting with looking at some maps. Most people are a little familiar with this one. So maybe you can tell me what we are looking at with these two maps. So here we're looking at, on the one side, producing emissions, driving climate disruptions, and we see how small on this map Africa is, how small on this map South America is, or what is now known as South America. Don't get me started on colonial namings of places. So that's on the one hand, and I think most people know that historically the West, European countries, and the US have disproportionately fucked up environment and climate. However, today there is an emphasis on China being the biggest polluter. So it might be good to also state some facts. Where do I have this? So in fact, the wealth of the world's 2,208 billionaires is now 5 times the gross domestic product of the whole of Africa, a continent that has only contributed 2% of cumulative global emissions from energy over the last 100 years, but is now suffering from extreme droughts, food insecurity, and storms because of ecological plundering. So also looking at not just nation states, but companies, only 100 fossil fuel companies or extractive companies have been the source of more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. Yeah, how's that for context? On the other hand, we have impacted by climate disasters, and we see that Africa, India, Bangladesh, Philippines, and many other places that have not caused mass disruption are actually the ones who are receiving the biggest impact. So I will be providing a link to my website where I provide extra sources, like where do I get these maps from, which articles did I consult. So for deep dive learning, you may go there. Moving on. So how does this big picture of this world inequality kind of relate to the Dutch colonial violence in the past? So you see here a few gentlemen that have to do with fossil fuels and deforestation. Maybe you recognize them, maybe you don't. But we look at them because the past is not dead. In fact, the past is not even in the past, and oftentimes, as we will see. So if you recognize, shout it out now. Here are the answers. So we're looking at the early founders of Shell, Royal Dutch and Unilever. Marcus Samuel, Sir Henry de Turning, and the Lever brothers. And questioning ourselves, like, do we know how they got to be in the saddle of mass ecological destruction, these companies? So how did ecocide begin? So we'll start with examining some colonial history, starting with the Lever brothers in Congo, ruled by Leopold II and later a Belgian colony. And we'll look at some horrific genocide combined with ecocide. So here it is. So the colonization of what was then called Congo was of a particular kind that was only a single person that owned the whole land, Leopold. And it went hand in hand with the decimation of half of its population, estimated 10 million people. I read, in the wake of genocide under Leopold, the Lever brothers swept into the Congo in the aftermath of the vicious drive for rubber that led to the slaughter of 50% of the Congolese populace. In this grotesque environment, Lever, soon to be known as First Viscount Leverhulme, became a sponsor of the forced labor that occurred on this land. Leverhulme's official relocated Africans to squalid work camps, taking villagers away from their own fields and food sources to work for nothing. Forced labor included children as young as 8 years old and caused such a crisis that the company exploiting the region did not grasp that development in itself was threatened by the drop of population that they caused. This is a note from a medical report, a gentleman, Dr. Mouchet, reflecting on the forced labor impacts. And so people were forced to deliver so much rubber, so much palm oil, and if they did not, hands would be cut off, legs would be cut off, or their children would be hanged. Anything punitive to motivate people to work harder for nothing. So this is the founding of the empire of Unilever today. Here we see the effects of this slavery, work camp, and amputation of body parts. So under this colony, the Leopold owned Congo by 1885 and turned into a Belgian colony in 1907 until 1960. We saw that palm oil production in the Congo, which was already there as a local business for small-time use, increased from 2,500 tons in 1914 to 9,000 tons in 1921 and to 230,000 tons in 1957. Such were the impacts and the deforestation that ensued. So for 2 months, all of this, of course, the expansion of the Lever brothers in the Congo to Nigeria and other places in Africa did not go without contestation, without revolt, without resistance. And here we're looking at some of the women of the Nigerian market rebellion in the 1920s. Most of my sources here actually come from a book, Grabbing Back. It's a book of essays by Alexander Reed Ross. I can really recommend in terms of learning. It paints a very graphic picture. So this revolt in the early 20s of the 20th century was a revolt that attracted about 25,000 women from Igbo women in Nigeria, who converged at native administration centers in towns like Owerri and Calabar and surrounding areas to protest the warren chiefs and taxes imposed on them, because they were supposed to pay taxes above their oil palm production. So instead of doing this for themselves, which they were, like already had ancient practices of, they were now supposed to produce for this market and pay taxes. The Igbo women not only attacked European-owned stores and banks and broke into prisons, releasing inmates, they also torched native courts run by colonial administrators. So these were fierce protesters that fought for their lives, their livelihoods, financial justice, environmental justice, and could be called the early climate justice rebellion. Only I guess most people have never heard of them, and our notion of climate justice struggle is probably not as encompassing. So this resistance is not only generally forgotten in the environmental movement, it is also written out of history altogether. How is it possible? Because of the colonial violence that followed. The revolt was put down by the chicote, which is a type of whip that colonists used, and the barrel of machine gun. And so time and time again, we see this white supremacy goes hand in hand with military supremacy. By the end of the Pende Revolt, the Labor Brothers had become so powerful that they could not only wage war against African population, but they could also wage economic war against the shipping monopoly of the West African Line Conference. So through Labor's subsidiary shipping company, the UAC, United Africa Company, this was also referred to as the African capitalist octopus. So here we see some ships. Unilever could single-handedly determine prices and quantities of palm oil available from West Africa. So it's no wonder that Unilever then sold soap, margarine, and such commodities at profitable prices with a market assured by the British government. And palm oil became the ingredient of the century, finding itself today in 50% of supermarket products, from detergents and cooking oil to canned foods, candles, glycerin, toothpaste. It's also noteworthy that it was used in explosives during world wars and as a weapon of imperialist global trade. So today, Unilever and Shell are actually both sometimes in the news for massive tax evasion in the Netherlands, not paying their profit tax. What profit are we talking about? Unilever reported a net profit in 2018 of 9.8 billion euros, compared to 6.5 billion euros in 2017. So they're still, booming, so to speak. And so we see, like, how is it possible that they're not paying their taxes? Well, they've been getting away with murder and a lot worse for literally more than a century. Here we see their first and primal product, soap. Also this racial idea of white cleanliness. The ship, which of course is already a marker of colonial trade lines. That's not surprising that also went hand in hand. So a little bit more about shipping and moving on to Shell. So here in the right corner, we see a little map, and we see the Suez Canal. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Shell Capital and how it got some of its first grounding. A note on financing all these colonial adventures, quote unquote. So we see in the story of Shell collaboration with the Rothschilds, who are known for getting rich of European nation states' warfare money lending. That's this family that basically, yeah, got rich, very rich, and then landed. And yeah, war was needed to keep this flow going. The oil business ended up accounting for 83% of the entire Rothschild's industrial investment at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is important because Shell also took over Russian oil fields from the Rothschilds and was granted to be the first oil tanker in the Suez Canal, funded by the Rothschilds. So as you can see, this trade route cuts a lot of distance. And if you think that Shell had its, or the Dutch brand of Shell, Bataafse Petroleum, had its first, like oil in Russia and in Indonesia, which was then the Dutch colony, it all comes together as painting a picture. So here we see the world map. This is early 20th century. And I highlighted 3 places: the Suez Canal, Indonesia, and Nigeria. Also thinking of Shell as this merger of a British company, Shell, and a Dutch company, Royal Dutch, and how both got privileged by their colonial position in land bases that were not their own, but that they could pillage and rob. Also looking at the words that are still used today in terms of Shell, entrepreneurship, they're discovering oil. I don't see so much the word adventure anymore, but these are all very colonial words. So Shell, to freshen up our memory, was founded in 907. The Bataafse Petroleum in 1920s was about 95% of the oil production was from Bataafse Petroleum in Indonesia. So you can see how much it appropriated and stole from Indonesia. Looking at the world map of a century ago, just before World War I, the British Empire spanned about around the world and occupied about 25% of the land mass. So that's a quarter of all land. So think about how much colonial advantage all corporations that started about a century ago had to take stock of expropriation, dispossession, pillaging, murder, and stolen lives to consolidate power of an emerging oil industry. So also noting that we talk about colonialism, but there's like, there's this weird thing that one type of colonialism, like the one we see in the US, this westward expansion, is called manifest destiny and colonialism. And the eastward expansion that Hitler had in mind is called fascism. And notice how that sits in your stomach, how fascism sits in your stomach, and how colonialism sits in your stomach. And somehow in history, we've been made to believe that one was way worse than the other. And maybe they weren't so different. Talking a little bit more about fascism and colonialism. Because both we will find in oil companies and how they intertwined with colonialism and fascism. We'll take a look at the history of the company we now call BP. Over the last 100 years, trace the arc of transnational capitalism. Its roots lie in the early years of the 20th century when a wealthy bon vivant named William Knox Darcy decided, with encouragement from the British government, to begin looking for oil in Iran. He struck a concession agreement with the absolute Iranian monarchy using the proven expedient of bribing the 3 Iranians negotiating with him. Under this contract, which he designed himself, Darcy was to own whatever oil he found in Iran and pay the government just a mere 16% of any profits he made, never allowing any Iranian to review his accounting. After his first strike in 1908, he became sole owner of the entire ocean of oil that lies beneath Iran's soil. No one else was allowed to drill for, refine, extract, or sell Iranian oil but this British dude. Winston Churchill commented, "Fortune brought us a prize from fairyland beyond our wildest dream. Mastery itself was the price of the venture." End quote. So that's colonialism for you. Another note on fascism is looking at De Terling, the CEO of the Dutch brand of Shell, who was a big fan of Hitler and who considered him a good friend, who also invested in Germany in the 30s in the car industry and industrialization. Let me see. Let me take my notes. Also, when De Terling died, he had a Nazi funeral, or he was honored by Nazis. You see the pictures. This was in the news. This was even in the New York Times. De Terling hated Jews and Bolshevism. And the end of the newspaper clip that we have here is, "As the coffin was lowered into the grave, a deputy of the Führer stepped forth and, placing a wreath upon it, said, 'In the name of Adolf Hitler, I greet you, Henry de Terling, the great friend of the Germans.' Field Marshal Göring sent a group of officers of the Air Corps to convey his respects." So there's actually a whole website on Shell Nazi history, where there's more of an archive of these clippings and how Shell also worked with GI Farben, who provided gas for the gas chambers and, well, not so pretty things. So you may think that was in the 30s and now everything is better, or you may not think that at all. But you would think that Shell at least knew not to call their ships after Nazi anymore, but they don't. In 2015, they made the news of the Financial Times. Shell attacked over Nazi history behind ship name. They named one of their vessels after Pieter Schelte Hedema. He was a convicted war criminal who served in the Waffen-SS alongside the notorious Josef Mengele, notorious for the reason of most gruesome torture, and who also worked for the SS sending slave labor to the Eastern Front. So this is in 2015. So yeah. Let's take a deep breath as we go along this not so pleasant history. Looking a little bit more to the British side of Shell and their presence in Nigeria. We'll go back to Nigeria because Nigeria suffered a double curse of resources. Many colonized places do. The resources that they are rich end up their reason for poverty. So here we see some of the protagonists of resistance against Shell in the last century, the Ogoni people of the Niger Delta. We see also the Ogoni area in the map in the south. So a bit about the history that preceded the oil grabbing and oil spilling conflict. So by 1894, the Royal Nigeria Company that was ruling this land base increasingly dictated whom the natives could trade with and denied them direct access to their former markets. In late 1894, King Koko renounced Christianity and tried to form an alliance with some others against this Royal Nigeria Company to take back the trade. However, in 1895, King Koko was offered terms of settlement by the British, which he rejected and disappeared. The British promptly declared him an outlaw and offered a reward of £200, which is more than £10,000 in today's terms, for him. He committed suicide in exile in 1898. So what then happened, the Royal Niger Company sold its holdings to the British government for this is £8,065,000. This is in 1899. So what does that mean? Effectively, Britain paid to buy the territory. British paid to buy the territory, which was to become Nigeria, from a company for the sum of £8,065,000. Yeah. The British facilitated a market that was favorable for British companies to control Nigerian resources, and so Shell, the British branch, and BP got head start in oil exploration permits. Also, in 1958, they hit the jackpot. So this is notable because in 1960, Nigeria were to receive flag independence, also sometimes called as the end of colonialism, but flag independence, as we will see, doesn't really end the relationship with earth extraction. So while why am I telling so much history? Because your head might just go fluttering like, well, I can't hold all these figures. So while today's storytelling really focuses on Nigeria oil spills and human rights in 1990s, the conflict goes way further back. And I think we should look at how markets and land and people have been controlled in this colonial area to get an understanding of why this violence and this license for monopoly is still upheld today. So that was a long story. Sorry about that. We'll pick up speed, and remembering this video is going to be the longest. The other videos are going to be way shorter. But the history is vast, even if we just limit ourselves to Shell and Unilever. So here we see in 1960, the end of official Nigeria colony, the white queen in African country, cheerfully handing down the power. But the power was handed down in a way that really divided and conquered still the land base. As we can see in the map above, there are many peoples, different peoples in the Nigeria land, and only 3 regions were really given representation in the government. And so this already caused frictions from the start, and we see a few years later there was a coup d'etat and there was a military dictatorship. And so we see the conflict that was enabled by divide and conquer for a long time. Moving to the 90s and Nigeria, and the huge uprising of 300,000 people. Talk about a mass movement for climate or environment against Shell in Ogoni land, indigenous people. When we talk about 300,000 people, we must think that just the total population of Ogoni people are 500,000 people. So 300,000 people, that's 60% of the whole kind of indigenous nation. That's huge. Where are we? Yeah. So To recap, between 1976 and 1991, there were many oil spills. The ones that are recorded are 2,976 from around 2.1 million barrels. So this quantity amounted to 40% of the worldwide oil spills by Shell, concentrated over an area of a little over 1,000 kilometers. The resulting damage to the soil and the poisoning of groundwater with carcinogens rendered farming, the primary source of livelihood of the villagers, unviable. So people were dying because of drinking the water, of not being able to farm anymore or fish. And so again, we see that their struggle, their environmental struggle or climate struggle, is one that is not separate from a struggle for survival, or what Western people call human rights, for living with dignity, for their livelihoods. There's all one struggle. And so we see Ken Saro-Wiwa emerging as a leader in this struggle. See him on the picture and his book, Genocide in Nigeria. And we see how the leadership of this movement has been killed off as Shell nudged the government, Abacha government, to take care of their economic interests. And we see leadership of a peaceful movement being framed for a crime they didn't do and being executed. And we see that today people are still struggling, people are still fighting in court. This year, 2020, is a big year. Esther Kiobel, the widow of Dr. Barinem Nubari Kiobel, who was also executed. You see she holds the picture of her husband. She is still fighting, and she's actually come to the Netherlands in 2020 to speak in the court case, Kiobel versus Shell, for justice. And after losing her husband, she's fighting for justice for him and clearing of his name, but also noting that she herself has been arrested and assaulted and intimidated, and also note that this violence of the spills and the health is ongoing. So even though we talk mostly about the 90s, a report from 2012 found that 16,000 babies died within the first month of life in the Niger Delta because of oil pollution. I will also add the link to the Guardian article and the report that is reporting on this. And this leads to the end of this talk on history, because this is the moment, 1990s, where mainstream starts talking about climate. Like whenever we talk about, we have been fighting for this for 30 years, like National Geographic, which is supposed to be an authority on, nature and environmental stuff. Climate change first became news 30 years ago. Why haven't we fixed it? That is an incredibly wide frame. Incredibly wide. Like all the stuff we just talked about. The history of how ecocide, genocide leads to climate change. The fact that you systemically kill and destroy, like total warfare on life in order to change the relationship to land as one where you can extract it for a resource, a raw material for money-making, private profit. That is a lengthy story of colonization. And so the frame of 30 years because in 1992, there was the first UN summit for climate. In 1988, the white man, Dr. Hansen from NASA, first started talking about climate. But that doesn't mean that climate change started in 1990. That's just ridiculous. So yeah, it's a blatant lie, even in science. the white man's frame of knowledge system goes back to at least Arrhenius in 1896. So he made this research in which he made a connection between greenhouse gases going up under industrialization and atmospheric climate change. So that's 1896. So like this whole erasure of history that gives us this small time frame, like, oh, we're just responding, white innocence, is even within the frame of Western science such a ridiculous thing. But I propose to go beyond Western science and look at the articulations, the resistance, the earth defending of indigenous peoples around the world. And then we encounter people like Tecumseh, Shawnee warrior chief, who noted the white man is a monster that is always hungry and what it eats is land. And this analysis of a colonialism that is relentless, not just in terms of killing 100 million people in the Americas, but destroying the land, destroying regenerativeness to conquer. So that's why in my activism, I think it's important that we uphold this anti-colonial climate framing of our house has been on fire for over 500 years. It's not a climate emergency in this tiny frame of the 21st century. It has been ongoing relentlessly for a long time. So ending this historical climate racism, setting the stage for the other three pillars, I will ask you to reflect on three questions. When did you think climate change history started? Like, where does the climate change story begin for you up until this point? Second question, where did you think climate disruption practices started? Like, if you place it on a map, like we started this talk, does it have a causal home place? Can we place it on a map? And three, why do you think you know so little about the history of climate criminal corporations and where they get their capital and power from, including their current license to commit violence against local people and places? So this is an assumption of me. Maybe you know tons about it, but like, even for me, a person who's super dedicated to, anti-colonial discourse in environmental protection and climate, it's been really hard for me to get more resources and understanding of what really happened in Indonesia under Shell in colonial times. So yeah, why do you think your knowledge is so limited about these coming of age of these imperial corporations? So that's it for this first video. Thank you for bearing with me, and yeah, take a break before you dive into the next one. Ciao.